Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. The sleek black Mercedes glided to a stop in front of the imposing French ambassador's residence. The driver's door swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his steel-toed boots crunching on the gravel driveway. He straightened his navy work shirt, brushing off a speck of sawdust, and ran a hand through his short brown hair. Taking a deep breath, he strode towards the grand entrance, his toolbox swinging at his side. As he approached, the ornate wooden door creaked open, revealing a petite woman in a black and white maid's uniform. "Good morning, sir. You must be the contractor. Please, come in." The man nodded, offering a warm smile. "That's right. I'm here to discuss the renovation project with the ambassador." The maid ushered him into a spacious foyer, marble floors gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers. "The ambassador is currently out, but Madame is expecting you. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to the study." As they walked, the contractor's eyes roamed over the immaculate surfaces and perfectly arranged furniture. He couldn't help but admire the meticulous attention to detail. "You keep this place in fantastic shape," he remarked. "It must be a lot of work." The maid glanced back, a hint of pride in her eyes. "Thank you, sir. It's a labor of love, truly. I'm Annie, by the way. Pleasure to meet you, Annie. I'm David." They paused outside a heavy oak door. Annie's hand rested on the polished brass handle as she turned to face him. "Madame will be with you shortly. Would you care for some tea while you wait?" David nodded gratefully. "That would be lovely, thank you." As Annie bustled off to prepare the tea, David found himself alone in the study. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and plush leather armchairs invited relaxation. He set his toolbox down and moved to examine a particularly ornate bookshelf. A soft knock preceded Annie's return. She carried a silver tray laden with delicate china and an assortment of pastries. As she arranged the items on a side table, David couldn't help but notice the precise, graceful movements of her hands. "That's quite a skill you have there," he said, gesturing to the perfectly arranged tea service. "I've always admired people who can make such tasks look effortless." Annie's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. "Oh, it's just practice, really. Though I do enjoy the finer points of household management." David chuckled. "You and me both. There's something satisfying about keeping a home running smoothly, isn't there?" Annie's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You enjoy housework, sir?" "I do, actually," David admitted, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Don't tell the other guys on the construction site, but I find it relaxing. There's a real art to it." A knowing smile played at Annie's lips. "Indeed there is. It's refreshing to meet someone who appreciates the craft." Their conversation was interrupted by the click of heels on hardwood. The study door swung open, revealing a statuesque woman in her late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored burgundy suit. "Ah, you must be the contractor," she said, her voice rich with a French accent. "I am Madame Beaumont. Please, have a seat." David straightened, extending his hand. "David Thompson, ma'am. It's a pleasure to meet you." As they settled into the leather armchairs, Annie quietly excused herself. Madame Beaumont's keen eyes assessed David, taking in his professional demeanor and the calluses on his hands. "So, Mr. Thompson, tell me about your experience with historical renovations." For the next hour, they discussed the intricacies of the project. David's expertise shone through as he outlined his approach to preserving the home's character while updating its infrastructure. By the end of their meeting, Madame Beaumont seemed satisfied. "Very well, Mr. Thompson. I believe you're the right person for this job. When can you begin?" David's face lit up. "I can have a crew here next week, Madame. We'll start with a thorough assessment and then proceed with the least disruptive work first." As they stood to shake hands, Madame Beaumont paused. "One more thing, Mr. Thompson. I noticed you seemed quite comfortable here. Have you worked in similar environments before?" David hesitated, unsure how to respond. I've always had an appreciation for well-maintained homes, Madame. Your staff does an exceptional job." A knowing glint appeared in Madame Beaumont's eye. "Indeed they do. Well, I look forward to seeing your work, Mr. Thompson. Annie will show you out." As if on cue, Annie reappeared. She led David back through the winding corridors, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "Congratulations on securing the contract," Annie said softly. "I overheard the tail end of your conversation. It will be nice having you around." David smiled, touched by her warmth. "Thank you, Annie. I'm looking forward to it." As they reached the front door, Annie hesitated. "Mr. Thompson, David, if you ever want to discuss the finer points of household management, I'd be happy to chat. It's not often I meet someone who shares my passion." David's heart skipped a beat. "I'd like that very much, Annie. Thank you." With a final nod, he stepped out into the sunlight, his mind buzzing with possibilities. Over the next few weeks, David threw himself into the renovation project. His crew worked efficiently, but he found himself lingering after hours, often engaging in conversation with Annie. They swapped tips on everything from the best way to polish silver to the most effective method for removing stubborn stains. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, David found himself alone in the kitchen with Annie. She was preparing a late supper for Madame Beaumont, and he'd offered to help. "You know," Annie said as she deftly chopped vegetables, "you have quite the knack for this. Are you sure you're in the right profession?" David laughed, but there was a hint of wistfulness in his eyes. "Sometimes I wonder. Don't get me wrong, I love what I do, but there's a part of me that's always been drawn to this world." Annie set down her knife, turning to face him. "David, can I ask you something personal?" He nodded, curiosity piqued. "Have you ever considered exploring that part of yourself more fully?" David's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" Annie's voice was gentle, free of judgment. "I've seen the way you look at the uniforms, how your hands linger on the fine linens. It's more than just appreciation, isn't it?" For a moment, David considered denying it, but something in Annie's open expression made him want to be honest. "You're right," he said softly. "I've always been fascinated by it all. Not just the work, but the presentation. The uniforms, the etiquette, the grace. I've even..." He trailed off, cheeks flushing. Annie finished his thought. "You've tried it on, haven't you?" David nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "It's not something I've ever told anyone." Annie reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "There's no shame in it, David. We all have different facets to our personalities. Have you ever thought about exploring this side of yourself more openly?" Before David could respond, the kitchen door swung open. Madame Beaumont stood there, an unreadable expression on her face. David jumped back, his heart racing. "Madame, She held up a hand, silencing him. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Mr. Thompson..." "David, I believe we may have an opportunity that could benefit us both." David's mind reeled. "I don't understand." Madame Beaumont's lips curved into a smile. "How would you like to experience life on the other side of the uniform, so to speak? We're always in need of additional staff, and I have a feeling you'd excel in the role." For a moment, David couldn't speak. His deepest secret, his most cherished fantasy, was suddenly being offered to him on a silver platter. You'd allow that?" "More than allow it, my dear. I'm proposing it. Of course, it would have to be discreet. Your work as a contractor would remain your primary occupation, but perhaps we could arrange for you to assist us part-time. A trial period to see how it suits you." David's heart raced. He looked from Madame Beaumont to Annie, seeing nothing but encouragement in their faces. I don't know what to say." Annie squeezed his arm gently. "Say yes, David. Give yourself the chance to explore this side of yourself." Taking a deep breath, David nodded. Yes, I'd like that very much." Madame Beaumont clapped her hands together. "Excellent! Annie, why don't you take David to the staff quarters and help him get situated? We'll start his training tomorrow." As Annie led him through the winding corridors of the staff area, David felt as if he were in a dream. They stopped outside a small but tidy room. "This will be your space when you're here," Annie explained. "Now, let's see about getting you properly outfitted." She disappeared into a nearby storage room, returning with a garment bag. "I think these should fit you. Why don't you try them on?" With trembling hands, David accepted the bag. He slipped into the small bathroom attached to his room, his heart pounding as he unzipped the bag. Inside was a classic black and white maid's uniform, complete with a frilly apron and a delicate lace headpiece. As he slipped on each piece, David felt a transformation taking place. The starched fabric against his skin, the subtle swish of the skirt, the way the uniform nipped in at his waist. It all felt so right. When he finally looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. A soft knock at the door startled him. "David, are you all right in there?" Taking a deep breath, he opened the door. Annie's face lit up as she took in his appearance. "Oh, David, you look wonderful! How do you feel?" "I feel like myself," he said softly. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm seeing the real me." Annie's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I'm so happy for you. Now we just need to add a few finishing touches. Come, sit down." She guided him to a small vanity, pulling out a makeup kit. With deft strokes, she applied a light foundation, a touch of blush, and a subtle lipstick. Finally, she adjusted the headpiece, tucking away any stray hairs. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. "Take a look." David turned to the mirror and gasped. The person staring back at him was undeniably himself, and yet completely transformed. Soft, feminine features had emerged from beneath his usually rugged exterior. I don't know what to say," he whispered. Annie squeezed his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, but we should think of a name for your alter ego." "Any ideas?" David thought for a moment. "Jenny," he said finally. "I'd like to be called Jenny." "Jenny it is, then," Annie said with a warm smile. "Now let's go show Madame Beaumont. I think she'll be quite pleased." As they made their way back to Madame Beaumont's study, David, now Jenny, felt a mix of nervousness and exhilaration. The unfamiliar sensation of the uniform, the gentle sway of the skirt, the click of low heels on hardwood. It was all so new, and yet it felt like coming home. Annie knocked softly on the study door. "Madame, we're ready." "Enter," came the reply. Taking a deep breath, Jenny stepped into the room. Madame Beaumont looked up from her desk, her eyes widening as she took in the transformation. "My word," she said, standing to get a better look. "Mr. Thompson, or should I say Mademoiselle?" "Jenny," came the soft reply. "If you please, Madame." A slow smile spread across Madame Beaumont's face. "Jenny, it suits you beautifully. Turn around. Let me see." Jenny complied, executing a somewhat clumsy twirl. The skirt flared out slightly, and she felt a thrill run through her. Madame Beaumont nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, Annie. She looks every inch the part. Now, Jenny, how do you feel?" "Like I'm dreaming, Madame," Jenny admitted. "I never thought I'd have the opportunity to experience this." "Well, my dear, the opportunity is yours. We'll start you as a junior maid under Annie's tutelage. If you perform well during your trial period, we can discuss extending your employment. Does that sound agreeable?" Jenny nodded eagerly. "Yes, madam, thank you so much for this chance." "You're quite welcome. Now, I believe it's time for your first lesson. Annie, why don't you show Jenny the proper way to serve tea? We'll consider it her inaugural task." As Annie led her to the kitchen, Jenny's mind was reeling. Just hours ago, she had been David Thompson, building contractor. Now she was stepping into a role she had only ever dreamed about. The weight of the uniform, the gentle swish of fabric as she moved, the subtle scent of lavender from the freshly pressed linens, it was all overwhelmingly real. In the kitchen, Annie began to explain the intricacies of preparing and serving a proper tea. Jenny listened intently, absorbing every detail. As she practiced arranging the delicate china on the silver tray, she found her movements becoming more graceful, more assured. "You're a natural," Annie remarked, watching Jenny's careful placement of the teacups. "Now let's work on your posture and gait. A good maid should move silently and efficiently." For the next hour, Jenny practiced walking with the loaded tea tray, learning to glide rather than step, to keep her back straight and her movements fluid. By the time Annie declared her ready to serve Madame Beaumont, Jenny felt as though she'd undergone years of training, compressed into a single evening. As they approached the study once more, Jenny felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. This was it, her first real test. Annie gave her an encouraging smile before knocking on the door. "Enter," came Madame Beaumont's voice. Taking a deep breath, Jenny pushed the door open with her hip, balancing the tray carefully. She glided into the room, her steps measured and silent. Madame Beaumont watched with keen interest as Jenny approached her desk. "Your tea, madame?" Jenny said softly, her voice pitched slightly higher than usual. She set the tray down with barely a clink, then began to arrange the items on the desk. Her hands moved with a grace she hadn't known she possessed, pouring the tea and offering the plate of delicate pastries. Madame Beaumont accepted a cup, her eyes never leaving Jenny. "Excellent, my dear. You've taken to this like a duck to water." Jenny felt a warm glow of pride. "Thank you, madame. I'm glad it pleases you." "Indeed it does. I think you'll fit in quite well here, Jenny. Now, why don't you and Annie begin your evening rounds? There's always work to be done in a house this size." With a small curtsy that she'd practiced with Annie, Jenny retreated from the room. Once in the hallway, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Annie beamed at her. "You did wonderfully. How do you feel?" "Exhilarated," Jenny admitted. "I've never felt so right." As they began their rounds, Jenny throwing herself into each task with enthusiasm, she couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn her life had taken. She'd come to this house as David Thompson Contractor, expecting nothing more than a challenging renovation project. Now she was living out a secret dream she'd harbored for years. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. By day, David continued to oversee the renovation project, his crew none the wiser about his evening activities. But as soon as the workday ended, he would slip away to his small room in the staff quarters, emerging as Jenny. Under Annie's patient guidance, Jenny's skills flourished. She learned the intricacies of silver polishing, the art of flower arranging, the proper way to turn down a bed. Each new task was approached with enthusiasm and dedication. One evening, as Jenny was meticulously dusting the library shelves, she heard the click of Madame Beaumont's heels on the hardwood floor. She turned, dipping into a small curtsy. "Good evening, madame. Is there anything you need?" Madame Beaumont smiled, her eyes appraising Jenny's form in the neat black and white uniform. "Actually, my dear, I wanted to speak with you about your progress." Jenny's heart skipped a beat. "Of course, madame." "You've exceeded all my expectations, Jenny. Your work is impeccable, and you've integrated seamlessly into the household. I think it's time we discussed making your position here more permanent." For a moment, Jenny couldn't speak. The idea of continuing this double life indefinitely both thrilled and terrified her. I'm honored, madame. But what about my work as a contractor?" Madame Beaumont waved a hand dismissively. "Details, my dear. We can work around your schedule. Perhaps weekends and evenings. The important thing is that you found your calling here. It would be a shame to let such talent go to waste." Tears pricked at Jenny's eyes. "Thank you, madam. I don't know what to say." "Say yes, my dear. Say you'll stay with us." Jenny nodded, a wide smile breaking across her face. "Yes, madame. I'd love to stay." As Madame Beaumont left the room, Jenny turned back to the bookshelves, her mind whirling. She thought about the life she'd lived as David, successful but always feeling like something was missing. And then she thought about these past weeks as Jenny challenging, exhilarating, and utterly fulfilling. She ran a hand over her apron, feeling the starched fabric beneath her fingers. This was who she was meant to be, she realized. Not just David or just Jenny, but both. Two sides of the same coin, each enriching the other. As she continued her dusting, Jenny felt a sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in her life, she was truly, completely herself. And in this grand old house, under the watchful eye of Madame Beaumont and the gentle guidance of Annie, she had found her home. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, startling Jenny out of her reverie. She realized she'd been lost in thought for nearly an hour, the feather duster idle in her hand. Shaking her head, she returned to her task with renewed vigor. There was still much to do before the night was through. As she moved through the house, attending to her duties with practiced ease, Jenny couldn't help but marvel at how natural it all felt now. The weight of the uniform, the quiet rustle of her skirts, the gentle clink of china as she cleared away the evening's dishes. It was all as familiar to her now as the feel of a hammer in David's hand. In the kitchen, she found Annie preparing a late-night snack for Madame Beaumont. The older maid smiled warmly as Jenny entered. "There you are, dear. I was beginning to wonder if you'd gotten lost in the library again." Jenny chuckled, setting down her cleaning supplies. "Nearly. I was just thinking." Annie's eyebrow arched. "Oh? Anything you'd like to share?" For a moment, Jenny hesitated. Then, deciding that if anyone would understand, it would be Annie, she spoke.
"I was thinking about how different my life is now. How complete I feel. It's like I've been walking around with only half of myself for all these years, and now I'm finally whole." Annie's eyes softened. She set down the tray she'd been arranging and moved to embrace Jenny. "Oh, my dear, I'm so happy for you. It's not often in life that we get to truly be ourselves." As they pulled apart, Jenny wiped at her eyes, careful not to smudge her makeup. "I just never thought it was possible to be both David and Jenny. To have this secret life that fulfills me in ways I never imagined." Annie nodded sagely. "Life has a funny way of giving us exactly what we need, even if we don't realize we need it. Now, why don't you take this tray up to Madame? I'm sure she'd appreciate seeing your smiling face before she retires for the evening." Jenny nodded, carefully lifting the silver tray. As she made her way up the grand staircase, she marveled once again at how easily she navigated the house in her low heels, barely a ripple disturbing the surface of Madame Beaumont's nightcap. She knocked softly on the door to Madame's private sitting room. "Enter," came the familiar voice. Jenny glided into the room, her posture perfect, her movements graceful. "Your evening refreshment, Madame." Madame Beaumont looked up from her book, a pleased smile crossing her face. "Ah, Jenny, just the person I wanted to see. Set the tray down and have a seat, if you would." Surprised but obedient, Jenny placed the tray on the side table and perched on the edge of a nearby armchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I've been thinking," Madame Beaumont began, closing her book, "about your unique situation. It occurs to me that we might be able to put your dual skill set to even better use." Jenny's curiosity was piqued. "Madame, as you know, we often host diplomatic functions here. It's occurred to me that having someone on staff who understands both the inner workings of the house and the more technical aspects of its maintenance could be invaluable. Someone who could oversee both the domestic staff and any ongoing renovations or repairs." Jenny's eyes widened as she began to understand what Madame Beaumont was suggesting. "Are you offering me a promotion, madame?" Madame Beaumont smiled. "In a manner of speaking, yes. You would still serve as a maid when needed, but you would also take on more responsibilities. Overseeing the staff schedules, coordinating with contractors, as both David and Jenny, you're uniquely qualified for such a role." For a moment, Jenny was speechless. It was more than she could have ever dreamed. A way to fully integrate both sides of herself, to use all of her skills and knowledge. I don't know what to say, Madame. I'm honored." "Say yes, my dear. Say you'll accept the position."
Jenny nodded, a wide smile breaking across her face. Yes, madame, I accept. Madame Beaumont clapped her hands together. Excellent. We'll work out the details over the next few days.
For now, why don't you go and share the good news with Annie? I'm sure she'll be thrilled for you.
As Jenny left the room, her mind was whirling with possibilities. She practically floated down the stairs, eager to tell Annie about this latest development. She found the older maid in the kitchen, finishing up the evening's cleaning.
Annie, you'll never believe what just happened.
As Jenny recounted her conversation with Madame Beaumont, Annie's face lit up with pride and joy. Oh, my dear, that's wonderful news. I always knew you were destined for great things here. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.